Hi everyone and welcome back. Today we'll be talking about what to avoid. We'll be looking at all the food groups in detail and looking at what's the good, the bad, the ugly, and as well as talking about some myths to be aware of, especially around weight loss and fasting and things like that. So let's start, and we are going to begin with the biggest thing to avoid. You might have already guessed it, and yes, it's junk food. So anything that has been so processed to the point where you can't even recognize what it is, or it's just a very different form from the original, like for example, string cheese as opposed to Parmesan. Huge difference. Or anything that is artificial, so anything that's made in a lab, and anything with an excessively long shelf life. Like, as you know, normal food goes bad after a couple of days. Some things, if fermented, would last longer. But when something can be packaged for 2 years or more, it's not real food and the body will not recognize it as real food. So this causes dampness as it can't be detoxed properly, it can't be handled or transformed properly in the body. So it becomes waste and it tends to be stored in fats or causing acne or just acidity in the body. Now, junk food tends to be sticky and greasy or very sweet or all of the above. So you may think that a burger is junk food, but gummy bears are definitely way more toxic to the body than bread and meat, so to speak. Of course, there are variations of that, and you do have burgers that are extremely processed. You don't want to put this in your body, but it is still closer to real food than what you see here in the picture. All right, now the next big topic is carbs. Carbohydrates have been vilified, but I'm sure you must have known from experience that when you cut them out, it puts you in a rut, basically affects your mood, affects your energy levels, and not to go too much into detail about fad diets, but in general, cutting carbs, you kind of feel really bad. So Chinese medicine views carbs as actually warming, energizing, and neutral. So they're both yin and yang, and they're tonifying, except for fruits because they tend to be a bit too sweet. But in general, it's a food that helps build the blood. It helps build your mental capacity, your physical capacity. It's also very soothing. So carbs are relaxing. Of course, mainstream media made it that ice cream is the go-to food when you're feeling bad, but actually it's a short-term solution. So the difference between slow and quick carb digestion. You have the complex carbs, which digest slowly over time, like rice, potatoes, etc. And then you have the faster digestion, which is like a sugar spike followed by a crash. And that's usually with the shorter sugars like fruits or more artificial things or sweeteners and things like that. So we all need carbs. We all need a good amount of carbs, but too much will cause acidity and dampness, and that will affect your organs, as you already know. It will also affect your bones and hair. So the idea is to have a bit of carbs in every meal and to balance it out, as we'll see in the next sections. Now, what about sweeteners? So when it comes to sweeteners, you want something that as close as possible to traditional things, meaning molasses and raw cane sugar. And yes, you might be surprised, but actual cane sugar is nourishing. It actually is blood building. It has a lot of minerals, trace minerals in it, and you actually will not be able to like overdose on it because it's already quite rich. So white sugar is the issue, but if it's raw, like that sticky dark brown sugar, that's actually pretty good for you in very small amounts. Same for raw organic honey, maple syrup, and rice syrup as well, or date syrup, and stevia, obviously in small amounts as well. You don't want to overdo anything that is excessively rich in sweetness. So in generally, like the most sustainable carbs to consume are the grains, especially in whole form, not too processed. Better to avoid the flours, but then again, a bit of flour to make a couple of things through the week is totally acceptable. And all the roots as well are very very good for you, very balancing, and beans, and we'll talk about beans in a little bit. But in general, carbs are your friends. You just don't want to overdo it. And quite frankly, it's hard to overdo carbs when you have enough vegetables on your plate, because you will feel full, especially when you're getting just the right amount of fiber. And when one hears carbs, they often think gluten. So what about gluten? It's an undigestible protein, means it goes directly through your body. You do not gain anything from ingesting this protein, despite some scams you might see and some false marketing out there. Basically, the problem with gluten is that wheat and rye and barley are three grains that grow in most of the world and initially contained very small amounts of gluten. But what does gluten do? Gluten allows things to be fluffy and sticky, means you can make really nice bread out of it. So as the crops became more commercial over time and humans started to breed certain things, they've come up with wheat that now contains 7 times more gluten than it used to. So you're being exposed to something that our ancestors were not exposed to. And some people are allergic to it, but others are just intolerant. And this is probably due to pesticide use, because pesticides, especially herbicides, which have been derived from a beetle. I mean, it's a long story, but basically what it does is that it can perforate the gut lining of animals, and we are animals too, so our gut lining is extremely vulnerable to pesticides. And this is why if you have an intolerance or suspecting to have an intolerance, you're most likely going to have to cut out other foods, because your gut lining is no longer protected, and that's where probiotics play a huge role. And you might also have to avoid oats and other foods that are triggering, which you might not need to get tested for, but you might figure it out, with trial and error. And in this case, it's also very important to eat organic to reduce your pesticide load from your food. Fruits are nature's candy, but that's what they're intended to be, just candy. It's important to stick to local and seasonal variations, because then our bodies are more well adapted to handle the sugar content or the starch content or the acidity. We'll be talking about this in probably a couple of weeks, but you have to keep in mind that tropical fruits are very sweet and therefore are more damp. So they're cold and damp. However, dark fruits and red fruits are a bit more heating, so they're quite neutral, such as dates, berries, raspberries, cherries, and they're also very good for blood circulation. And we're going to revisit this later when we talk about PMS. But in general, fruits are a little nice thing to have at the end of a meal, and better to be consumed by day, so that your body has time to handle all the sugar content from it. Moving on to fats. Fats are actually amazing. They support yin. They're very grounding. They slow you down, which can be good or bad depending on where you're at. They help to build and repair tissues, and this is why cholesterol is actually great, especially in its raw form. It helps repair your blood vessels. And because it's yin, but it actually turns to yang, because as it's warming and energizing, it gives you that push. So it's a very yang effect. And remember when I said some people need to be slowed down? Well, basically, if you're so up in your head, and if you're nervous, and if you're feeling all over the place and scattered, or if you have a thin and cold tendency, you will need fat to kind of regroup and recenter and just slow down. So people who are so much in their heads, they need dense foods. But if you are already quite a dense person, if you feel a bit heavy, then fats will only slow you down more. But again, it depends on the fat and it depends on the purity of it. So you have the good fats and the bad fats. The good fats are like the ones in the picture, olive oil, coconut, butter, ghee. But the bad fats are the more transformed ones and extracted in unhealthy manners. And these will cause weight gain, heaviness, as I said, and dampness. So some examples to avoid are canola oil, any hydrogenated or homogenized oils, cottonseed oils because of the pesticide content, and rice bran oil. Now, protein. Protein is very interesting because, well, there's a big dietary trend now going on between veganism versus keto, carnivore, and all that. But what's interesting is that from the Chinese perspective, the plant proteins, like mostly legumes, so beans and peas, are mostly drying, so they combat dampness. So excellent if you have water retention, but not so good if you're thin and frail. On the other hand, soy and meat are a bit more dampening, and of course, depending on the fat content. But as we said before, if we balance a meal, you don't really have to worry about this too much. Now, proteins are important for your growth, for your cell repair, but also your water and sugar balance. And be careful with this because as we eat more protein, we tend to crave more carbs. So just as long as you're choosing the right carbs, you have nothing to worry about. Now, meats and seafood are generally more easily assimilated than plant protein because the cell structure is more similar to ours. So it's like the body identifies it as an easier source of protein to assimilate. Meats are also used to treat all kinds of deficiencies, be it yin, yang, qi, or blood. So they're quite potent, powerful. You definitely want to include them if you're feeling weak. But of course, too much of it will affect the kidneys, will also be acidifying on the system. So in that regard, plant protein is more sustainable if you want to eat larger amounts of it. And of course, like we said, everything depends on the individual constitution, depends on the person. It's all about making a balance for what works for you. Adding on to the proteins, we also have the issues of eggs, nuts, and dairy. So I'll go through them one by one. To start, we have eggs. They're quite a young food, but they nourish yin. So this might be a bit confusing to you, but think of it that way. The egg is like the seed of life. It's the womb. It's a very feminine energy to create. So it has a bit of both. Okay, but because it's warming, it has proteins, it has fats, so it's young. Now, unless you're consuming them raw, eggs are most likely going to be hot and damp. Keep that in mind, although not to an extreme, but they do have that power, which is also a good thing because it's a great source of fat. It's also very good for any issues with blood, so it will build your blood, especially if you're on your period. It's a great food to have at that time. It's also a good breakfast option because it's a harmonizer, meaning it brings all flavors together. You can easily add vegetables and spices and herbs, and it will blend everything well, just like a vegetable omelet when you think about it. The only thing to keep in mind is that eggs are a product of their environment, so you do want to get high quality, farm fresh, organic. You want the yolk to be orange, so please avoid cage hens, avoid the ones that are commercial brands in supermarkets. Similarly, nuts and seeds are the source of creation. So from a seed, you have a tree after a couple of years. So it's a very yin energy. It tonifies yin in the body, which helps with lubricating your systems. But because it's a fat, it's also quite grounding and heavy. So again, good or bad, depending on the person consuming them. They protect the liver, the nerves, the skin. They're in small amounts, they're good to feel radiant. And they're also warming and strengthening, so they have a tiny bit of yang in there as well. And similarly to most damp foods, they're going to be better for thin, dry, nervous people, but too much of it will be an excess dampness, so you want to be careful with that, especially with roasted nuts, because they're hot and damp, and the fats have been transformed at high temperature, so it could be a bit disturbing for some sensitive people like myself. And also be careful with the storage. They do go rancid quite quickly, so you want to avoid storing them in plastic, in direct sunlight. Make sure to keep them in a cool, dry, and dark place. Now, dairy, a big, big, big topic. So if we go back to old times, dairy was amazing. Amazing. I mean, you can make something creamy and yummy and so nourishing from just taking care of animals. Like, it's an amazing thing. But what happens when we have commercialization, machines that pump out milk, cows that are given so many hormones? I mean, it's honestly a nightmare what's happening in the dairy industry. But if we go back to the original, dairy is amazing. So stick to A2 cows if you're in the north or in the west. Otherwise, stick to buffalo products, goat, sheep milk, or even camel milk, because these animals are eating the closest thing to their natural food, and they're not being forced by machines or other weird things that happen in the industry. So dairy in general is quite damp, of course, depending on how much fat it is. It's, as you know from the previous slides about fats, it's beneficial to weak, thin, dry people because it lubricates. It also helps bring people a bit closer to center, ground them if they feel scattered. And as you can imagine, someone who has cold damp or damp heat, dairy might not be the best thing. If you have a cold, for example, then you are very cold damp and you should avoid dairy. I'm sure you've heard that before, and it's actually very good advice because dairy does create more mucus. It's dampness. All right. Now, if you take raw milk, it has all the enzymes you need to digest it. But if you cook it, you lose these enzymes. And of course, if it's pasteurized, if it has a long shelf life with additives, there is no way you can digest this thing that they have created. But if you eat raw fermented products like Parmesan, yogurt, kefir, cottage cheese, you're good to go. You're also fine with mozzarella and feta as long as they're made fresh and not in a package that would last a lifetime. And in general, if you want to eat dairy, the best way to do so is with dark leafy greens, especially if cooked, with whole grains, beans, nuts. It goes nicely in a salad, as a topping, not as a main thing. So when it comes to salt, I'm sure many of you have heard that salt is bad for you. You have to keep your salt minimal, but that only actually applies to table salt, which is iodized, highly processed salt. And in this section, we're talking about the real salt. So we're looking at sea salt, whether it's Celtic salt or wherever you live, or Himalayan salt, rock salt, desert salt. All of these are great. So there's actually quite a grounding energy. If you think of the ocean is water, and water is a feminine force, so it's a yin energy food. It's also cooling and alkalizing, meaning if your diet is a bit acidic, a bit maybe heavy on carbs or meats, adding salt actually helps neutralize that. And this is also why salt has been used in desserts for a long time, why they even drink tequila with salt. It actually helps to neutralize, and it counters toxins. It moves things in the body. If you are constipated, adding salt to your diet actually will help move things. It also strengthens your digestion because it helps you create enzymes that help digest your food, as well as hydrochloric acid, which comes from chlorine, and sodium chloride is salt. So you definitely want to have that in your diet. It also tonifies the heart and mind, meaning it gives you focus and clarity and grounding. Now, if you have a lot of salt cravings and you want to bring that down, then first switch to the salts that are mentioned here and get your salt naturally from broth, eggs, meat, anything from the sea, roots, and leafy greens. Now, I really wanted to include this in because we all love chocolate. We've all probably grown up eating chocolate, and it's actually not as bad as you might think. It just, again, it depends on how you consume it. So chocolate is bitter, and it has a yin energy. It works on the heart because bitter is the flavor of the heart, and it actually opens the heart. So you actually want to consume it when it's not sweetened to get the most of it and to actually feel that bitterness. And it's actually a pretty good source of fat because it's solid at room temperature and it's minimally processed. Best to avoid like all the milk chocolates, the very sugary ones. Stick to dark chocolate, stick to even keto chocolate if you can get your hands on that. Or if you can do 100% cacao, then that's great, and you can maybe add honey to it. Coffee, coffee, coffee. It's extreme young. It gives you that stimulation. It's actually very warming, but it's also going to affect the heart, and it's going to affect your blood sugar levels. Like you have a spike, you think you have energy, but it's fake energy because it's nervous energy, and then you crash and then you want more. So it's a bit of a vicious cycle there. It can cause anxiety, insomnia, heart disease, or even intestinal issues. If you want that stimulation, you can actually get it from herbs. So definitely make sure you get a consultation with someone before this because it depends on your body type. But for some people, it will be black tea. For others, it'll be green tea, um, depending on whether you're hot or cold. And licorice is also great if you're feeling a bit low. St. John's wort or nettle are also very nice herbal options for that clarity of mind. Now, coffee can help with constipation, but because it's acidic, you definitely want to be careful about the sourcing. So avoid all the commercial ones. Uh, they've been stored for so long and ultra processed. You are better off getting organic grains and then grinding them at home, or just buying small amounts of ground up coffee. That's probably the most accessible to all of us here. Alcohol is damp and hot because it's usually fermented or kept in barrels for a long time, so it has that dampness. And heat because it's a pure yang energy and it expels cold from the body right away. It's generally a festive thing. So, from the Chinese perspective, alcohol is meant to be used in celebration as it amplifies any feelings you feel. So, it will amplify joy. And it's a good way to calm down the energy at night. So it's best to be kept in times of festivities and not to be done out of boredom or to escape any emotions. Now, alcohol stimulates digestion because it's quite heating and it moves energy. So this would only be applicable to some people or some circumstances. But of course, too much alcohol would affect the heart and liver. So in case of leaky gut or any heat and damp symptoms, you definitely want to avoid alcohol. For example, candida or a yeast infection or urinary tract infection. Lastly, we're looking at water. As simple as that may sound, it's super important. So warm water helps support the spleen and the whole body. Your body is like a machine. So if you pour cold water on it, it's going to slow everything down. Remember, cooling is yin, so it's slowing. And there is a big misconception about how much water we need. So you might have heard that we need 8 cups a day. And that's completely wrong. We need as much as we need. So for some people it's less, some people it's more. Just keep in mind that water will pass right through you and not be properly absorbed if it's dead, like if it's too filtered out, if it doesn't contain enough minerals or nutrients. So the best way to ensure that you're properly hydrated is to have water in a tea, like a herbal tea, or with lemon as an infusion. Like in the picture here, that's also a great way to have stimulating spices that help with digestion, and at the same time you're getting well hydrated. But also in terms of broth, so if you're heavy on soups and liquid food in general, you might not need as much water as someone who eats more meats and dry foods. Great, so having covered all the main food groups, you have probably a better idea now of what works for you and what doesn't, what you should let go of. But another very important point is how and when to eat. So breakfast is super important. We should start with an appetite. If you don't have an appetite in the morning, it means that your spleen is probably functioning a bit less than it should. Breakfast should be the biggest meal of the day, and it's better to have it warm, savory, and liquid. By liquid, I mean no smoothies, but if you want to have, for example, like something with a soup on the side, or broth, or even like a rice pudding, these are all very nice introductions for your digestion. Like for the first thing that your digestive system receives in the day should be liquid. It really helps with your bowel movements. And of course, if it's warm and savory, it will help reduce any cravings throughout the day. And then we should stop eating 3 to 4 hours before bed. Now, the frequency of meals depends on your age. Um, in general, 3 meals a day is a good basis. They don't all have to be the same size, but it's a good intake. Above a certain age or after menopause, smaller meals are preferred, so 5 to 6 meals a day. Now, the combinations matter a lot. If you have carbs and proteins together, they will digest slower, but they will make you feel full. So if you're an athlete, you might prefer to go with this. But in general, you want to keep your proteins with greens or your carbs with greens. Of course, if you have too much carbs or carbs only breakfast in the morning, you might have an afternoon crash. And so that's probably a sign for you to include a bit more protein, a bit more salt, a bit more fat in the morning. And try to always balance the flavors. So if you're going to have a bit of a, like let's say sweet potatoes, a bit of a sweet meal, if you add some herbs to it, that's some bitterness. If you add something a bit more pungent, like you want to have maybe a ginger tea on the side, you will feel that you're just somewhat more balanced. And we'll talk about this when we are creating our own meal plans. Now let's talk about weight for a little bit. It's quite difficult to gain weight if you're not consuming damp foods and yin foods. But at the same time, if you have issues losing weight, then dampness could be the main cause. Now remember that carbs are our friends, but carbs also help form fats in the body, which is why people who cut out carbs completely, they will initially have weight loss. But is that sustainable? Probably not. So it's all about having the right ratios and the combinations. Like we talked about fruits, it doesn't make you fat per se, but because it's damp, it's sweet, you want to keep it to a minimum. But there's no such thing as mangoes make you fat. That's a total myth. And there is no weight loss food. There is no weight loss drink, no weight loss tea, none of that. There are just foods that heat or cool. So it depends on where you're at and with the dampness and the dryness. So remember, it's all about eating for your constitution. Now, one last word on fasting. If we're constantly eating, we're constantly taxing our system and making it work. So it gets tired. So imagine if you're eating all the time, your body is working all the time, and it gets tired, it gets sluggish, your spleen and your pancreas and your whole lymphatic system, so it's quite a big system, it gets tired and it can't do its job efficiently. So it's gonna start creating dampness in the system. Now, if you eat in smaller windows, like let's say for 8 to 10 hours a day, that's better with space between your meals. Then you're giving your system time to rest. This is why intermittent fasting has become quite a thing, quite a trend. I do agree with it to an extent, but we should just never let it stress us. So never go hangry, only go hungry. And when you get hungry, you eat. If you're not hungry, sometimes it's better not to eat or to eat something small, but never starve yourself. And this is something we'll talk about in the next video. Now, for the more intense kinds of fasts, like water fast or dry fasts, it depends on your constitution, because if you're already hot or dry type, the dry fast might not suit you. You might be happier on a water fast. But this is, of course, a spiritual journey and decision. So I'll leave you to it, and this concludes our session today. Thank you for listening and have a beautiful day.